Hello, listeners, and welcome to an emergency episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Cousin Marco and I recorded an episode on Friday that was supposed to post today, but we decided to push that back until tomorrow so that we could deal with some of the events of the weekend. By the way, Cousin Marco and I make predictions about the Nuggets Timberwolves NBA playoff series in that episode. Spoiler alert, we were wrong. So stay for the geopolitics analysis, but the NBA analysis is just entertainment. But the reason we're gathering, it's twofold, but the main reason that we're gathering here for an emergency episode is the death of Ebrahim Raisi, Iran's president, at the age of 63. Raisi and his foreign minister were in Azerbaijan over the weekend inaugurating a dam on the Aras River. The Araxes River, I think, is how the history books call it. If you're thinking about ancient Greece, it's one of the biggest rivers in the Caucasus. Not really a navigable river, but produces a significant amount of power and also provides irrigation water for a significant, I think it was something like 1 million acres. When I was reading about the Aras River itself, I went down a little rabbit hole there. It doesn't look like there was any foul play in Raisi's death. So Raisi, his foreign minister, a couple others were flying back to Iran from Azerbaijan in a helicopter. The weather was not particularly good. They went down in a crash and there were no survivors. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that there was any foreign involvement in any of this. I will just say the timing is super weird. When you think about the ongoing sort of shadow war between Israel and Iran over what is happening in the Gaza Strip and in the rest of the region, it looked like the tit for tat things were completely over, and it seems like they're completely over. You had, Iran striking Israel a couple of weeks ago. I guess was that even a month ago? Israel responding backwards, but there really hasn't been anything to suggest that there was going to be any escalation between Israel and Iran in the first place. So I think the first place that people's minds are going to go to here was, is this a Mossad operation? Is this a CIA operation? Is this an internal Iranian thing where somebody wanted to get rid of Raisi in general? There is no evidence to substantiate that claim. Now, that doesn't mean that there might not be something going on beneath the surface, but Iranian press and media has been fairly transparent about this from the beginning. They noted when they lost contact with Raisi's helicopter. They noted that they were having trouble with the rescue efforts. They noted when he was dead that there's no subterfuge or secrecy here from the Iranian regime. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can go down the rabbit hole and say, well, that's because Iran doesn't want the world to know how weak they are and how their enemies were able to do something to their president. It's a conspiracy theory. You can't refute that kind of logic, but I'm sure that sort of thinking is going to be out there. And I just want to reiterate, none of that, there's nothing to substantiate any of that. And I think that ultimately this will mean a lot more for Iran internally than it will mean for anything sort of foreign policy wise in the region. We're going to have Kamran Bukhari come on the podcast later this week to do a deeper dive into Iran. And we've talked about Iran significantly on this podcast before, but I'll give you sort of a Cliff Notes version now. You should think of Iran really as a bunch of factions fighting themselves, fighting amongst themselves for power within the Islamic Republic. And that fighting is largely kept in check because the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he's the dictator. He is the big boss. He's the one that calls all the shots in Iran. Certainly more so than Raisi as president, certainly more so than when Hassan Rouhani was president. Khamenei is 85 years old now. He has had some health issues over the past couple of years, but literally since I started my career, so we're talking over a decade now, I've been hearing about how Khamenei is sick and he's frail and he's about to die. I doubt anybody thought that Raisi was going to die before Khamenei when all this started. So that just sort of tells you how unexpected things are in general. All of that is to say that as long as Khamenei is alive and able to project some level of power, all of this infighting is really below the surface, and everybody is positioning for what to do when he dies, for who gets to select the next supreme leader. Now, I'm going to very, very crudely simplify because Iran is not a monolith. You can't even boil it down to two camps, but I am going to boil it down to two camps. On the one side, you have the pragmatists, and on the other side, you have the hardliners. The pragmatists are best embodied by Hassan Rouhani. He was the Iranian president before Raisi, who took Iran into the nuclear deal with the Obama administration, who tried to pry economic power away from the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a weird paramilitary organization in Iran, which is charged not with, well, at least it's not supposed to be charged with defense of the nation or anything like that. The IRGC is supposed to defend the revolution, defend the revolutionary principles that brought this theocratic state to power in 1979. Now, they have since metastasized far beyond that. They play a huge role in Iranian foreign policy. They have swallowed up large parts of the economy. Anywhere, I mean, it's hard to get estimates on this. I've seen estimates anywhere from 20 to 60% of the Iranian economy is being controlled by the IRGC. And Rouhani was trying to turn that back. And that's what the pragmatists want to do. The pragmatists, they're not anti-clerics. They're not anti the religion of the regime. I want to make that clear. They work within the confines of the regime. But they want more open commerce. They want markets that are a little more liberal, for lack of a better term. They don't want the IRGC to control everything. They're not interested in the hijab police being out in the street and making the country, a reactionary medieval religious sort of state. On the other line, you have the hardliners, and again, it's really hard to boil these down into one faction. But the IRGC is the main power in that particular bloc, and had close relations with Raisi. They also had close relations with Ahmadinejad, and some of the things that Ahmadinejad and Raisi shared is that under those administrations, the IRGC was able to increase economic power. And there was more sort of fighting with the West, not caring about the nuclear deal so much, wanting to enrich uranium, thinking of things in more zero-sum geopolitical terms rather than in economic terms. It's why Iran was much more willing and open to negotiation under the Rouhani regime than it necessarily was under the Raisi regime. So Raisi came from that tradition. The thing about Raisi, though, and there was some speculation that he might take over as supreme leader one day, we are not talking about a charismatic figure. We're talking about somebody that was handpicked probably by the supreme leader to be a caretaker of the government while Khamenei got up there in age. So probably Khamenei has some kind of succession plan in mind. He's gotten in some hot water because it looks like he wants to appoint his son maybe as his successor. And I say it looks like that because when he's been sick or been in the hospital or been indisposed, he's delegated some of his powers to his son. That's a big no-no for the revolution. The revolution was to get rid of the hereditary shahs and to instead appoint these religious leaders who were recognized to be the leaders of their generation. So if Khamenei really wants to do that, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing. And you're going to have even hardliner components are going to be against that because the idea of a return to dynastic succession within even this theocratic state, like technically the IRGC should be strongly against that. Like I said, they protect the revolution, and passing on leadership to your son is not protecting the revolution anyway. But so I think Raisi was a hand-picked candidate by the supreme leader, somebody that the supreme leader thought he could trust, somebody that did not have a power base of his own or an ideological faction of his own, somebody who was not charismatic in the same way that Hassan Rouhani was, or who wasn't going to have delusions of grandeur. Raisi himself is also a cleric, so he has a religious upbringing, a religious education. He thinks sort of from that frame of the world. It's one of the reasons I think people thought that he might become the next supreme leader in general. So it's not, I don't want to say it's a huge loss here. It's just to say that what has happened is that the supreme leader has lost the person that he thought was going to oversee things as he got up there in age and planned his succession plan. That's a big loss, but it's not like Raisi had his own power base and that somebody's going to rise and take his power base and challenge the supreme leader. We don't know a ton, or at least I don't know a ton about the man who becomes Iran's next acting president until they can hold elections. This is Mohammad Mokhber. He has a pretty shadowy career. Robin Wright, who's a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Wilson Center, points out that usually Iranian vice presidents are not there to be contenders to succeed their bosses. They're the fixers. They're the ones who allow the regime to run while they're in office. They're the ones that do things. And that really, that rings true for Mokhber's career. He doesn't have a lot of high profile, even media appearances or a lot of experience here, at least when it comes to government itself. He has held senior positions in very, very powerful Iranian organizations. So industrial conglomerates or banks or shadowy charity foundations, which are actually probably, part of an opaque network of financial entities that are tied to the Iranian state. So he is also basically a fixer. He's really within the regime itself. He's not gonna make any big surprises here. Policy is coming from the supreme leader on down. Now the question is, as somebody gets picked to replace Raisi, is that person going to be another hand-picked caretaker candidate from the supreme leader, or is this internal competition between the pragmatists and between the hardliners going to start to come out into the open? Is the fact that Khamenei is now 85 and has been in the hospital a couple times and has been sick a couple times and has tried to pass off some of his power to his son, is that going to cause some friction? Is that going to cause some opposition, even some resistance from those who don't want a Raisi type candidate or don't want somebody that the supreme leader is going to appoint in general? I'm very curious to see what Kamran has to say about this later in the week. But my best guess at how this is going to go is just not to underestimate Khamenei. Yes, he's frail. Yes, he's had some sickness issues. It seems to me that he is still the one calling the shots in the Iranian political system. And as I've said a couple times over the last couple of years when we've talked about Iran on the podcast, I think it'll be very, very interesting when he dies what happens to Iran. I have my fears that what's going to happen is the IRGC is going to consolidate control, and it's not going to be so much a theocratic state as just sort of an IRGC military dictator state. It would be a little wrong and a little out of place to compare it to Egypt, but that's the sort of model that I think this is heading in, because I'm not sure that this sort of dual theocratic quasi-democratic regime with these paramilitary groups running around and things like that, I'm not sure that that works in the long run. And I think a lot of people know that, especially because there is no figure like Khamenei waiting in the wings, or who has the gravitas or the necessary level of support to move forward. So I think, honestly, this probably doesn't change a whole heck of a lot, because I think policy is still coming from the supreme leader. It's when the supreme leader passes away or is indisposed or takes the wrong helicopter somewhere, that I think you'll really start to see the fireworks in Iran. But that said, the things to be watching for here is, now that Raisi has died, now that there's going to be a competition for who is going to replace him, do we get any sort of insights about what's happening with that internal competition with Iran and what that says about Iranian policy going forward? I would suspect not, and we will double check that with Kamran. I'll be talking to other sort of Iranian experts and policy experts here going forward. But my sort of first 24-hour take, that's what I've got. Second, and before I leave you, I just want to say that there was an attempted coup in the Democratic Republic of Congo over the weekend as well. It doesn't look like it was a particularly well orchestrated coup. There are also not a lot of firm details here. DRC officials are saying that this guy, Captain Christian Malanga, is the one who led the coup. It sounds like he was killed during the attempted coup and that his son has been captured. He was a resident of the United States, where his family secured political asylum when he was a child. He contested parliamentary elections in the DRC in 2011 and was arrested and detained for several weeks under the leadership of former President Joseph Kabila. When he was released from prison, he went to the U.S. and he founded the opposition United Congolese Party, and he has sort of popped up all over the place, campaigning for things like religious freedom or anti-corruption and things like that. But this doesn't look like somebody who had a whole heck of a lot of power here, and I'm not sure why, if he did do this, why he pushed forward with this. It sounds what happened, or at least what DRC officials are telling us, is that there were two separate attacks. One is on an ally of the current president, Felix Tshisekedi, and the ally is supposed to succeed, or he's the favorite to become the next Speaker of the National Assembly. There was also an attack on the presidential palace, the official presidential residence. The president was not there at that time, but there was an attack there. The fighting was intense enough that apparently some ammunition that was fired from the capital hit the city of Brazzaville in the neighboring Republic of Congo, which is separated from Kinshasa by the Congo River. So it wasn't like this was a small thing. DRC officials says that 50 people have been arrested, including 3 American citizens. So that's also going to cause people to think, well, maybe the CIA is at work here. And the CIA does have a sort of unsavory history in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, probably not a whole lot to conclude from this failed coup. It looks like a fairly poorly imagined and conceived and executed affair. The deeper issue, and this is something we've been covering here on the podcast since January, is that the Democratic Republic of Congo looks awfully unstable, even by DRC standards. You remember we had Ben Shepherd on at the very beginning of the year to talk about the DRC and some of the things that are going on there. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that episode from January. I've also reached out to Ben, and I'm hoping he's going to come back on here in the next month or two. Also, if you have been keeping track of the Global Sit Rep that I author every week, or if you are on the Cognitive Investments Knowledge platform, you know that almost every other week I'm logging some new thing that happened that tells me the fighting in the eastern part of the DRC seems to be getting worse, and Rwandan support for rebels in that part of the DRC seems to be getting more intense. And you've got other countries, whether it's Burundi or Angola, other countries that are starting to not get involved. Involved is a little bit too strong, but are starting to take note of how bad things are getting in general. We also just a couple of weeks ago had the first fighting that really started to impact some of the mineral producing areas in the eastern DRC. So this is a place where there's a lot of cobalt. And remember, the DRC produces almost 70% of the world's cobalt. There's copper, there's gold, there's a bunch of other different mineral commodities as well. So the only reason anybody ever brings up the DRC is, of course, these mineral commodities. I think it's much more important because if you had the sort of regional war that happened in the late 1990s, because you've got these different countries that are trying to settle scores with each other by supporting rebel groups that are inside this restive part of the DRC. I mean, the last time that happened, it led to millions of deaths and millions more displaced and all other sorts of things. And if you had that sort of situation in today's unstable world, and especially with everything that's going on in the Sahel, with all the complaints about migration, Ethiopia also flashing warning signals all over the place. I mean, it's never a good time to have this sort of conflict, but man, there's just a lot of stuff there that makes me nervous. And I've said, I'm not sure if it's just that I've been learning about the history of this region and I've been reading books like Dancing in the Glories of Monsters and King Leopold's Ghost. So maybe I'm just seeing these things all over the place. But my spidey senses are going off in a really bad way in terms of the state, in terms of the risk of interstate conflict here in the central part of sub-Saharan Africa, which would not be particularly good for a lot of different reasons. So attempted coup, probably not a whole lot there, but there is a whole lot of fighting in the eastern part of the DRC and a whole lot of diplomatic machinations that we need to continue to watch there to see if my spidey senses have any worth. So that's about it. Two on the surface, sort of very intense incidents. In the end, probably not that important in and of themselves, but really do open a window into some very important forces that are going to be important here in the coming years. So I hope you enjoyed the emergency episode. Cousin Marco and I are at it next week. A lot of great, interesting content is coming up. Not just saying that, I feel like I had a 2 or 3 week lull there because I was traveling and I got a little bit behind, but we've got some great guests that are coming on, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of them. So take care of the people you love. Happy Monday. What a way to start your week, right? I hope you guys have a good week, and you'll hear more from me soon. Cheers and see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.